Good morning, Snipes Academy. It is Friday, April 30th. I'm Mr. Yates, and this is Snipes Daily News. All right, everybody, welcome back to another fun-filled Friday at Snipes Academy. Let's go ahead and get into it with some weather. So today, right now, as of this recording, it is 72 degrees and partly cloudy. It should not rain for the rest of the day, although it will probably stay cloudy, with a high of 83 degrees. For today's This Day in History segment, we're going to talk about George Washington. On this day in history, April 30th, 1789, George Washington took his oath of office and was inaugurated as America's first president. I know. You're probably thinking to yourself, Mr. Yates, this is like the fifth time you've talked about George Washington. To that I say yes, and I will continue talking about George Washington because he is absolutely my favorite president. In my opinion, the best president we've ever had. A very good argument could be made for Lincoln as maybe the first best. Sometimes I flip-flop on who's first and who's second. Those two, though, there's no contest. Those two are definitely on top. But let me go over three reasons why I think that, in this case, George Washington is the best president we've ever had. Number one, he was an actual commander-in-chief. Today, we refer to the president as the commander-in-chief. Well, in George Washington's case, that was an actual fact. George Washington, before becoming president, was the commander-in-chief, the leader of America's Continental Army. Number two, Washington was a great decision maker. Now, by this, I don't mean that he made decisions and they had to be followed. They did. But what made him a great decision maker is his effort to include everyone in the conversation. So his two closest confidants, people who he would ask for advice from regularly, were Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Both of these men, to say they hated each other would not be an exaggeration. However, Washington included both of these men very closely. As a matter of fact, he made Jefferson his Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton his Secretary of the Treasury. Another thing that made him a great decision maker was he took a lot of things under consideration, but the decision was always his own. He always came to his own conclusions. He didn't just blanket go with what someone said, right? He always took it under his own consideration and then made a decision. Dedicated himself to being a leader for the whole country, not just one region, one economic class, or even one political group, aka one party. Third, last but not least, George Washington rejected the idea of becoming a monarch. So there are dozens of times where George Washington was asked to be the king of America in perpetuity, for all time till his death and his descendants, blah, blah, blah. But he rejected it every time. So I'm going to give you two specific examples of when he rejected it. So the first, the Revolutionary War had come to an end. It was a couple of months after the Battle of Yorktown. They wanted to make George Washington a king. This was spearheaded by a colonel named Colonel Nicola. And when he wrote this letter to Washington saying, this is what we think, we want you to be king, which they could have done. They had an army. They could have sort of made martial law and made Washington the king if they were so inclined. So it was there if Washington wanted it. However, his reply to Nicola was very fast, very swift, and very cut. He said, he expressed his astonishment that such ideas even existed in his army. He totally rejected the idea of establishing a monarchy in America with himself as king. He said, "Banish these thoughts from your mind," he wrote. Whether he realized it or not, in denouncing a monarchy for the United States, General Washington had made his first important decision as a political leader by rejecting a kingship for himself. The second time that I'll talk about, shortly after he was elected for his second term in 1792, something like that, his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, resigned so that he could run for president. People thought it was pretty incredible that he would even attempt to run against George Washington. However, George Washington astonished the nation by not seeking a third term. He didn't want America to have a ruler like other monarchies. He wanted a real democracy with checks and balances. So, to the astonishment of everyone, he resigned. He did not seek a third term. A leader who seeks more power than they are given is destined to be a terrible leader. Terrible. Like, it's gonna happen. If you're in power, you're elected, or you find yourself as a leader, and then you try to abuse that power or try to take more power than you've earned or have been given, you're destined to commit evil acts. The fact that George Washington, who was offered multiple times to become the king of America, rejected it and even didn't want to be president for more than 8 years. And that in my mind is probably the highest quality that George Washington could have possibly shown. And in my opinion, making him not only the first president, but the best president we've ever had. Last but not least, let's move on to some birthdays. All right, today, April 30th, we only have one birthday, and that would be Anyla Howe is in kindergarten and is turning 6 today. So if you see Anyla in the hallway, make sure you wish her a very big happy birthday. And that about wraps it up for us today, guys. So I hope you all have a great, fun-filled weekend, and I will see you here on Monday. This is Snipes Daily News.